The following is a conversation with Bram, founder of Stenography, OpenAI Developer Ambassador, and GPT-3 O'Reilly Media Instructor. Bram is known for his creative experiments with GPT-3 and Codex, such as generated poetry, self-interviews, or contactless communication with the computer. He launched Stenography in 2021. His startup leverages both GPT-3 and Codex to automate the annoying tasks of writing code documentation. Stenography found instant success, launching as the #1 product of the day on ProductHunt. If you're interested in GPT-3, make sure to subscribe and check out our GPT-3 manual book by O'Reilly Media. This is Sandra and Shabam, and we hope you enjoy this interview.
Bram, thank you so much for your time, finding the time to sit down and talk with us today about your experiences with the API, OpenAI API. You've recently came out with Stenography that you've been working on for many months back, kind of as a stealth mode, or at least not, sharing it with the world as generously as you are now. And it recently became an awesome success, becoming the #1 product of the day at the ProductHunt. Congrats on that one.
Thank you.
So we are super curious to kind of dive a little bit deeper into sort of behind the scenes of how Stenography came into being, and why you decided to work with it.
So I think basically I like making code content a lot, but the problem with content and code in particular is that no one's really going to admire the beauty that you put into your code base. You know what I mean? Even if you put it on GitHub where it's like very public, 98% of the GitHub population uses GitHub to go and download a file and use its functionality, right? They don't actually sit there and read the functionality of the code. And I found that, for most of my projects to kind of get FaceTime in front of other people or grab their attention, there needed to be some kind of video component or blog component attached to it, right? Because that's generally where people were kind of like watching almost like the marketing materials for the program that you made, right? So a lot of programs, I feel like, don't have a good enough content arm. So they kind of just exist in the darkness, right? We have a bunch of just programs that are on GitHub with 0 stars or 1 star, and they might be amazing programs written by people, but because they're not well documented or well shared, it's really hard to kind of get them the visibility that they might be needing, right? So Stenography was kind of an attempt for me to think about how documentation could evolve in such a way that it doesn't need to be an annoyance for developers, right? Like a lot of the time when you're writing code, documentation is kind of just the next thing you do. And it's hard because with documentation in particular, you have to justify what you did, right? So you say, oh, I use this library to do this thing, and then I decided to use this thing, and then I added this function to do this thing. And basically, documentation is a way for humans to reach out to other humans, whether that's themselves in the future or other people on their team, or again, like I said, just interested people who are stumbling across your GitHub profile to be able to understand your project, right? And the way that you could think about that is, the 98% group on GitHub, again, always checks the README first. Like the README is the first thing that everybody sees. They immediately scroll down to it. They're like, how do I npm install this? What is the usage, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, I was kind of interested in the idea if GPT-3 could create understandable comments. And that's a whole topic within itself. But I was pretty impressed with the level of explanation that I was getting from GPT-3 and Codex. And I was able to kind of leverage that in a way where I was like, how do I make this really easy and enjoyable for developers?
that sounds great. That sounds like a great idea to come up with. Going a little bit deeper into what you just said and how stenography came into picture, can you discuss a little bit about your product architecture and how the different components leverage different parts of the OpenAI API?
Yeah, so I guess from a high level, there's two main processes. There's the parsing process, and then there's the explanation process. And both of those kind of require um, different strategies. So the parsing process, basically, I spent a lot of time understanding complexity and like complexity process of code, because the thing is, not all lines in your code are even worth documenting. Uh, there are some lines that are obvious. There are some lines that are no operation lines. There are some lines that are no longer useful because the code has moved past that. Uh, so being able to, and then there's you have the opposite problem where you could have a huge 800 line function, and then that's going to be too big to understand, right, in one go, right? There's a lot of logic in that, right? You have to like break down that logic to many different kind of steps to be able to say that, accurately that this is what this thing does. So once I kind of understood that, I started thinking, how can I leverage parsing to be able to find blocks that are sufficiently complex but not too complex? So that was the main architecture challenge of the parser layer. And with the explanation layer, that's more of a feature of kind of getting GPT-3 and Codex to say what you want them to say. So a lot of that is kind of just like finding creative ways to understand your audience and who you're writing towards for humans, and then getting GPT-3 to speak to your audience, and then doing processing on my side as well.
Yeah. No. Just a follow-up question on that. You discussed about the parsing process and then the process where GPT-3 and models like GPT-3 and Codex comes in and gives the explanation. So on the parsing side, let's say you have a very long code base, like do you apply some intelligent filtering criteria using some language models or some kind of NLP there to understand which part of code is important and which is complex enough to go for an explanation that might need an explanation. Like let's say you have 800 lines of code, you won't be giving explanations for all of them. That will be very complex and a pricey task to do. So on the pricing criteria, can you elaborate a little bit, like what kind of filtering you do uh, to retrieve the content or to retrieve the code lines that are important, that are complex enough to go in the next stage?
Well, like, the filtering process is an evolutionary process, right? So it doesn't really stay static. It really depends on how it the feedback that I get from the actual explanations layer from the AI, right? So sometimes it might be, uh, I might learn that certain blocks are too complex and certain blocks aren't complex enough. And because everybody writes code differently, it's kind of a matter of trying to attach to um, the abstract syntax tree and just work with the best of what you have. I think with a lot of this probabilistic programming in general, we're just working with what we got in a lot of ways. In the sense of, uh, it can attempt to solve any question, but it might not solve it at 100% accuracy like you would get with something like a calculator. If you type 2 + 2 = 4, occasionally you get 5, but you don't need to write all the functions for multiplication and division and subtraction. Those come for free. So that's the trade-off that you make with these probabilistic systems, is that sometimes they work and sometimes they don't. So you have to kind of like figure out and be uh, fluid enough to change your strategy.
Yeah, yep, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, thank you.
So, Ram, I wanted to ask you a little bit about past experiments. You've been a very active member of the OpenAI developer ambassador community. and we have seen super cool demos of you using GPT-3 to generate poetry, like all sorts of very, very, I guess, very creative. Yeah, I guess that's the word I'm looking for. Experiments that also caught attention of others. And we wanted to ask you about like what were like a little bit about what were your experiences so far with these use cases, and sort of trying to understand why you actually went for the one that you're diving into and not the previous ones.
I think a lot of those experiments were me just kind of unconsciously edge testing what a language model like GPT-3 can handle. Because it's kind of interesting, when this was my first kind of experience, GPT-3, excuse me, was my first experience with a kind of like a AGI. It's obviously not an actual artificial general intelligence, but it does general things. You could ask it about, weather. You could ask it to, change every name to a capitalization. You can ask it to add numbers. You can ask it about countries. So it was general enough, right, to be able to say like, oh, I can. What would I do if I could ask a computer to do anything, right? And I think that with a lot of those experiments, a lot of them were just shower thought curiosities. You know what I mean? I just was like, oh, poetry is a kind of neat thing. And I had been scrolling through Instagram and I was like, oh, an Instagram poetry thing could be kind of neat. Or, with the self podcast thing, I was like, oh, it could be cool to leverage this technology to kind of like, speak to digital versions of ourselves for like journaling purposes, or for I'm trying to think of the other project that was off the top of my head. The Spotify little DJ search thing, kind of like auto building a Spotify playlist based on like a vibe that you type. A lot of it was just again just kind of poking at the corners of this thing and seeing how far I could go. Just having fun. Honestly, I think that that's a big component. Sometimes people will build technology because they're obsessed with business, and I don't think that that's healthy. You get burnt out, and unless you really care about your problem, and then some people will get blinded by the technology that they're using to solve their problem, and get stuck in a local maximum where they're just trying to optimize something that they shouldn't be optimizing. They should probably just move on. So I guess the reason that I settled on stenography amongst all of those is a few things. I got pretty good signals from the external world that this could be very helpful to a lot of people, right? So that was the first thing. I never really had built something for other people. Like usually, like obviously, like the AI poetry thing and the Spotify thing. Like unless I was working for somebody or taking a client, all of my stuff was just to satisfy my own curiosity. So stenography kind of like hit the middle point, which was really awesome that I haven't experienced much in my life of like, this is valuable to people and and it satisfies my curiosity. So that's kind of why I settled on stenography. The second big reason is that I got really good early on at understanding the different engines of GPT-3, and I think a lot of people just immediately rush to DaVinci to go solve all their problems. But if you can solve something on a smaller engine like an Ada, Babbage, or Curie, you actually get to know the problem a lot more deeply than you would if you were just trying to throw the whole AI at it with DaVinci.
Those are some very interesting use cases, Bram. So moving further, just wanted to ask that have you experimented with other language models other than GPT-3 to build a similar product experience like stenography? And if yes, like what were your outcomes so far? If you can share the results of your experiment and how's your experience been, the quality of output, and all these things.
I haven't really, unfortunately, had the time to play around with other language models. I think for me, I'm pretty firmly in the implementer status, in terms of like, there are some people who are researchers and there are some people who are implementers. And one of the reasons that, I really enjoy working with OpenAI so much is because their researchers are just really so top notch, you know what I mean? And they're really pushing the envelope. So I know that I'm getting the cream of the crop, basically, of kind of like natural language processing models. And I have seen some news about like other models out there that are interesting as well. But I think for my particular use cases, I haven't really had a need to kind of like branch out, because I was like, there was just so much to do in this natural language model that didn't really need to kind of decide to go somewhere else.
Yeah, we're glad that you actually stayed a little bit longer with these models and experimented with them to show us different types of demos and like what can be done. So coming back again to your sort of extensive experience in finding different use cases for OpenAI API models, and also especially now having the experience with GPT-3 and Codex in stenography. Do you have any sort of like big brother or words of wisdom to somebody that is starting out right now in terms of deciding which model would be, better for their use case, how to even go about the process of finding out how to use these models for the problems that they're trying to solve?
If they're watching this before January 6th, I would tell them to come to my O'Reilly class, because I do talk about that. I think in general, my feedback to people in office hours is always to kind of really understand their problem first, and then kind of start to head into the OpenAI API to choose a model and choose an engine and choose parameters. And I think that should happen kind of in that order. Like sometimes, a lot of my office hours people will come and they'll have these huge problems. They'll be like, how do I build a rocket ship from scratch using a prompt? And I'm like, well, like there's a lot of components of a rocket ship. So I think that that's the first thing that I would offer as advice is, GPT-3 isn't a panacea. It's a very, very powerful machine only if you know what you're using it for. Like you could say the same thing about like any not natural language model. You could say the same thing also about any kind of like Turing complete language, like a JavaScript or a Python or a Java or a C, like literally all of them, right? The general programming languages, like they're extremely powerful, but only if you really understand recursion and for loops and while loops and exactly what you're trying to solve with those tools.
Yep, that makes total sense. So, Bram, stenography is built with an API first approach, just like GPT-3, how GPT-3 has been offered in the form of an OpenAI API, in the form of OpenAI API. At the same time, the code base for organizations, startups are their secret sauce and they don't want to make it public. So when you ask them to use your product to create documentation for their code base, how do you make sure that you ensure a right level of privacy and security for their code base?
Right. So as it stands, stenography is a pass-through API, so I don't actually store anything. So basically, it's like a toll road, right? So it's a transformer, so people will pass in their code, and then I'll send up a signal that says that they use the API, right? And then it passes through, right, without like being saved or logged or anything like that, and then just gets passed on because I'm using a serverless architecture. It does keep track of, like I said, like the invocation counts, right? So like how flags how many times that they used it, and then I also do have systems written into my code to prevent abuse as stuff as well, because some people just like to abuse things on the internet. It's just the internet. So outside of those guardrails, I would say that like in general, when it comes to privacy and security of code bases, I try and take on the same opinion as like as again just trying to be as safe as possible, you know what I mean, right? Without being unreasonable. And I think that that's kind of where many companies should lie. I think it's way too easy to fall on the other side of getting either indifferent or paranoid, and you don't want to be on either side. If you're paranoid, you never get anything done, and if you're indifferent, you never get anything done for a different reason.
Okay. Yeah. So on your side, it's a pass-through API, so you understand you don't store the code and everything. But on the other side, when it for sure goes to the OpenAI servers, the GPT-3 models and Codex, and I am thinking like it goes in the same form as the code is written without any manipulation, right? Uh, do you have some contract set up with OpenAI to maintain that data silos for different organizations, or some clause which doesn't allow OpenAI to use the code base of these organizations for further retraining, so that anybody with anybody anybody in the world can give certain input and get these kind of code bases as output when trying to generate something using Codex or GPT-3. So is there some kind of mechanism or system set up to ensure the security or the privacy of these organizations who are going to use your product?
Well, I mean, as it comes to OpenAI's TOS, stenography is pretty obviously a superset on their TOS, right? Because of using it as a product, right? So I wouldn't be able to answer that question. That would have to be something that would be, spoken about with actually OpenAI. I think in general, though, people who are using this technology are aware of like the qualitative gains of it. Again, in terms of like it really depends, right? Because of course there's a bunch of SOC2 forms, and people can go down entire rabbit holes of like maybe we just icebox our whole code base and we just never let any of it off site. And again, I personally think that falls in line with paranoia. You know what I mean? Like I've met a lot of companies who think that they really have the secret sauce, and then like the secret sauce, I think, in a lot of ways should be their creativity, not the way that they use their React code base. Maybe that's just me, but yeah. So to answer your question with a kind of non-question, is that yes, stenography is a superset of the OpenAI API's TOS.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
So building a product based on OpenAI API so heavily, you really get to sort of intimately interact with it, and we are very curious always in such cases if there were any hurdles, like what sort of big challenges you had to face in order to make stenography a reality. I know you're early on in this path and there will be challenges to come, but so far, what was it for you? And also, did you manage to overcome it or not? If you could share with us some lessons from that would be awesome.
I think, again, a lot of my work in the past had been very standalone, not really edge tested, kind of only worked if you held up your computer 23 degrees to the sun and, like we're standing on one leg, right? So very specific uh, activation catalyst requirements for a lot of my projects. So I think building stenography, the biggest challenge that I faced was just building an ecosystem that worked all the time, right? So just like finding all the different edge cases, really thinking about all the different ways that users could be using the tool, thinking about the design layer of the API, thinking about how fast it has to be, thinking about how frequently it has to like respond with this type of thing versus that type of thing. How does it act in this language versus that language, right? So there was a bunch of open questions, and some were harder to solve than others. There were some meta questions along the line of kind of like more kind of like technical meta questions in my mind that were the ones that I was most captivated by. Specifically, what is the thing that is being helped by having an AI documentation, right? And what is the thing that is helped by documentation? So it really became a lot of like, it became a lot more meta than I thought it was going to be. Right? It started off super not meta and then became very meta very quickly. So I would say that was the hardest thing, was dealing with the meta levels while also being able to have conversations like this at the top level, right? So you would want to be able to talk to other people who haven't been like deep in the sauce of this particular problem and tell them from a high level what's going on, but then also knowing that I'm hiding a lot of information from you from all the things that I've like built, you know what I mean, that wouldn't be valuable to that kind of like conversation, or would be just too meta. Right?
Yep, yep. So far we talked about the challenges that you face while using an API, and with challenges comes the wisdom. So for all the budding entrepreneurs out there who are looking forward to build their own startup, their own venture with GPT-3, what will be your 2 words of advice on building and scaling a product with the OpenAI API?
Hmm. Small engines, probably. You know, small engines or low temperatures in terms of like the OpenAI API, because I can't predict what their prompt type thing will be, like what they're trying to do, and I can't, uh, who their end user is. But using smaller engines and lower temperatures is just better in general for both of those things.
As far as I understand the API, like this is one of the great advice you can give to someone in general if you
Hmm.
have to give advice. So yeah, pretty great.
Okay, cool. So thank you for that. We are also curious when it comes to the OpenAI API pricing model and how you're sort of thinking of it in terms of working together with your business, whether you like how you priced your business to sort of go hand in hand with the API pricing. How does that work in Stenography's case?
I mean, it's the same kind of calculation, right? Where you do a superset, almost similar to the kind of like TOS question of the pricing that you pay. I think one of the nice things about the economy that we live in, specifically for people who want to make startups, it's never really been easier to use a bunch of pay-as-you-go services, that you can buy off the shelf, excuse me, like Auth0, Stripe, Algolia, that don't charge you anything until you start getting usage. Cloudflare Workers, AWS, GCP, like literally pretty much all of them, right? So Firebase. I would say in general, pricing is a moving target of understanding how people are like using your software and how to make their uh, lives, like finding a fair price, right? And it's hard to fairly price something that people haven't really tried before. And I think that that's the kind of big struggle with a lot of these new AI brand startups, is they don't have a lot of competitors. So it's really hard to say, is this a, you know, $10 a month product? Is it a $50 a month product, or is it a $1 a month product? You know what I mean? And where does it fall in those categories? And I think it just depends. It depends on how solid your use case is. It depends on how fast you want your responses back. It depends on uh, how many people are using your service. It's, all of those come into play when deciding pricing. Uh, if you've raised money or if you're bootstrapping. So it really, I think, depends. And if someone is in the business of creating their own AI business, I would tell them to not be afraid to use buy type technology, like Auth0 and Stripe and Algolia and stuff, because it only really starts costing you anything if people start using it. And a lot of people will go the opposite route, where they will, again, be like, I need to just build it from scratch. I don't feel comfortable unless I build it from scratch. And then they spend 12 months building something that's worse than Auth0. So, if they want to spend a year of their life doing something worse, like, all more power to them.
Yep, that totally makes sense. Like we today live in an era of like this trade-off, like building from scratch and pay-as-you-go service. And in general, we are seeing this trend uh, opting towards pay-as-you-go service. Moving on from that, Bram, like we are curious to understand, like, do you actively collaborate with OpenAI regarding your recent project Stenography? And if yes, like, do they provide any kind of support to make the API responsible for better suit your needs, or any kind of specialized support with prompt engineering or model fine tuning that's not available for public?
Again, some stuff I can't talk about, but I would say that in general, people who pass production review do have a dialogue with OpenAI that they can ask those questions to, and speak to them about those kind of questions, right? It depends on what they're kind of going for, and different companies have different agreements with different people, and I can't talk about any of it. So
Makes sense. But thank you for commenting on that nonetheless. So I guess we are wrapping up. It was very interesting to learn from you on the on your current and previous work with the API. We still want to find out though, what's the next exciting thing for Stenography? What are you planning as the next step, if you care to share with us?
Yeah, so I think that this calendar year, the big thing is I've built a product that I'm very happy with, and when I show it to developers, they're very happy as well. And I think that, I noticed that I could get trapped in my own heuristic kind of vortex of now I can continue to just build, build, build. But the building gains that I'm getting actually out of Stenography right now are like pretty logarithmic in nature, where I've kind of capped out, right? So it's like I can make my parser layer smarter, I can make my explanation layer faster and smarter. But those are just kind of like percentage gains. They're not like cataclysmic, right? Like solving the parsing thing was really cataclysmic. Getting autopilot working in Visual Studio Code was really cataclysmic. So this year is going to be mainly focused on selling and talking to developers. To be honest with you, it's not going to be Stenography isn't going to be as much about building as really kind of perfecting the product and kind of like one of the my favorite real life product is Lectrum journals. I never know how to pronounce it. It's this German brand of journals, and the paper is just so thick and well done, and the binding is so beautiful, and the leather just like smells great and has like this like perfect kind of like tautness to it. And they have a little card, which actually is probably subliminal messaging to kind of get you to like their product more, where it says details make all the difference, and I think that that's kind of like where you get to some products where you kind of start working on the details of making it faster and making it a more enjoyable experience without necessarily needing to go and build 30 other products on top of it. So it really just depends, but that's going to be the main thing that I think I'm going to attempt to solve with Stenography this year, is to kind of really just reach out to a bunch of developers and just kind of like get on the ground and talk to them and make the product better.
That's amazing. I love your metaphor, and I'm really looking forward to seeing how you're going to upgrade the user experience or the existing user experience. Yeah, all the best with your venture. We are so excited for it. It's been a big pleasure discussing that with you. And I guess, Shabam, do you want to add anything? Is there anything that we?
Yeah, just want to thank you, Bram, for taking out time and sit with us and doing this interview. It means a lot and will be a great resource for the readers of the book, and we really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you for having me. I'm really excited to read the book, and let me know if you guys need anything else.